How to build challenging encounters against a vampire. Note: this has been prepared utilizing only the 5th edition core rules. The vampire can be found in the Monster Manual pages 295 to 298. Don't do it. That's right, my first suggestion for fighting as a vampire is simply this: don't do it. The vampire as a monster has been used as the villain literally thousands of horror movies, hundreds of novels and multiple television series, with years worth of episodes and stories beyond count. There are entire game systems dedicated solely to vampire lore and the roleplay of vampires. The chance that you'll be able to pull off a vampire encounter that is not a cliché rehash is minimal, to say the least. Now add in the other major reason that vampire stories in D&D games are hard to pull off satisfactorily. In almost all good vampire stories, the heroes spend the first half of the story in an unbelieving stupor watching their loved ones die, unable to act decisively because, obviously, it must be some mysterious wasting disease, or there must be some other logical explanation to what's going on. This lasts until some old professor shows up and wakes them up to the reality that there are such things as monsters and that they must act. Characters in Dungeons & Dragons already know that monsters exist. Without the doubt that plagues the characters, the indecision, and the probable personal involvement with one or more of the direct victims of the vampire, the story is less interesting. I want to try it anyway. Despite my declarations that creating an interesting encounter with a vampire is a very difficult challenge, you intend to give it a go. Okay. Then, your first and most important task is to keep the players in the dark regarding the fact that a vampire is on the field of combat at all. Do your best to forget that it is a monster. You must consider it a non-player character. It is best that this non-player character be someone your players have met and interacted with. Maybe not often, but often enough to know them and have some ideas about their personality. If your players ever bring up vampires in conversation, treat the topic with disdain. Mere stories. Vampires are lawful creatures that go to great lengths to ensure that their existence remains in the realm of myth and legend. Nothing more than a silly superstition that is the stuff of scary stories. The vampire values its unique ability to pose as a living being, able to fully interact with the living. It may even do so during daytime hours, though never under direct sunlight. Vampires are masters of the plausible explanation. They will often arrange for their actions, especially their feedings, to be disguised as the result of some other cause. The supposed cause can be natural, violence, or even monstrous, provided it cannot be directly attributed to vampire action. Vampires are aware of telltales that the legend states identify the vampire. They have considered ways to counter some of these that are truth-based. Vampire society has even invented legends that imply things that a vampire cannot do. But obviously they can, in order to avert suspicion and avoid detection. Collectively, this strategy is referred to as the Masquerade. The Masquerade. Vampires refer to their ability to blend into normal society as the Masquerade. With their nearly brilliant intellects, every vampire understands to reveal their actual existence to society would result in immediate and violent consequences. Graves opened, persons drugged from their daytime sleep to perish in the sun, and countless other potential perils. Lore number 1. The Grave. This item of vampire lore is true. Every vampire is vulnerable when they rest, and rest can only take place in their grave, tomb or crypt. The unlucky vampire who rose without proper burial must rest under the very soil upon which their transition to and death took place. The counter: as thoughtful planning creatures, many vampires will go to great lengths to prepare additional resting places. This can be done by transporting a great quantity of the grave earth or by moving their coffin to another location. It is possible for a vampire to set up several resting places this way. Not raw. A vampire can rest in the grave of any vampire spawn that they have created or that is under their control. They will sometimes convert individuals who would seem to be otherwise unsuitable as vampire spawn, for the simple expedient of providing themselves with secret and unsuspected resting places. Lore number 2. Reflection. A vampire casts no reflection and has no shadow. This lore is also true. The counter: Vampires prefer dimly lit spaces or darkness where their lack of a shadow will not normally be noticed. Additionally, they take great care to avoid places where reflective surfaces are common. Magic using vampires, or those that have since acquired magical abilities, can use some cantrips and other low-level illusions to fill in the blanks, and provide themselves with either a shadow or a reflection if necessary. Lore number 3, Water. A vampire immersed in water is like a man immersed in acid. This item of vampire lore is partially true. A vampire immersed in running water is harmed, but still water isn't lethal to them. The counter, a vampire might take a swim in a local lake or a possible cave grotto, even host a party for society to bathe in the moonlight. They might even use servitors or magic to temporarily block the flow of a running body of water to allow safe immersion, only to release it after they have exited the water. Lore number 4, Daylight. A vampire in direct sunlight is helpless and subject to destruction. This item of vampire lore is also true. The second portion, often uttered in the same breath, is that vampires are trapped in their graves while the sun shines. This second portion is a subtle twist that has prolonged many a vampire's existence. The counter: by emulating the lifestyles of the idle-rich, they will rarely have to venture out during the daylight hours, allowing their servants to handle their ordinary affairs. Still, as social creatures, they will attend events that would be impossible for someone trapped in their grave. The restriction is only that they must avoid direct sunlight. Thickly curtained carriages will allow them to attend the theater, go to dinner parties or appear at fashionable establishments. Based on travel times, they must have left their home long before sunset to arrive even fashionably late. The most important fact is that they can be, and often are, active during the hours of daylight. They simply will not expose themselves to daylight. Lore number 5, Blood. A vampire drinks blood to live and must have it to sustain their existence. They cannot eat or drink any normal or wholesome food. This item of vampire lore is a good example of mixing truths with lies to create a deception. It is true that vampires must drink blood and must have it to sustain their existence. The counter: exactly how much blood a vampire must have to sustain its existence is not known. Some vampires may be able to fast for days, weeks or even years if sufficiently motivated. There is even rumor that a fasting vampire can enter a state of hibernation and sleep away a year, a decade, a century, to emerge at a time of their own choice. Not raw. Can a vampire eat or drink substances other than blood? Raw never covers this in any definite way, but I think that in order to employ the Masquerade successfully, they'd have to be able to pass and eat this test. I think it would be fair to say that while they can ingest food and drink, they can derive no sustenance from it. The avoidance of food and drink is mainly due to the flavor. Imagine a heaping helping of muddy sand while drinking seawater, and the need to expel the substances consumed later, as the vampire has no ability to digest. Lore number 6, Forbiddance. A vampire may not enter a residence without an invitation from a resident. This item of vampire lore is true, at least as far as it goes. The counter: primary: few structures are, during the era in which most games are set, only residences. They are businesses on the first floor, with a residential section above. Even in a single-family dwelling, imagine the following two common scenarios. The good wife of the house takes in laundry for her neighbors and does their washing for a coin or two. A traveler passing by the home is tempted by the delicious smell from pie baked by the good wife for the family supper. They purchase some, giving her coin for her trouble. In both cases, the residence is not quite a residence anymore. Secondary: catching the eye of a resident and using either charm or simple persuasion to gain an invitation, is not excessively difficult for a vampire. Lore number 7, Sacred Objects. While it is indeed true that a vampire is damaged by holy water and can be turned or even destroyed by a holy object, the simple fact is that such objects may only be utilized by those that have the strength to do so. That means access to the ability to channel divinity. The counter: vampires have long spread the take that they are repelled by the mere presence of holy objects and that they cannot enter consecrated ground at all. It just isn't so. While holy water can indeed harm them, a little sleight of hand substitution, or perhaps that by a charmed or loyal minion, could dispose of the dangerous substance long before it could cause harm. Vampires may handle holy objects freely, until they are used to channel divine energy. They are just jewelry. Lore number 8, the stake. A stake driven through the heart will kill a vampire. A stake driven into the heart of a vampire that has been incapacitated and found in its resting place will paralyze a vampire, not kill it. The counter, vampires themselves have spread this tale as a last-ditch effort at escape. How many adventurers have walked away, believing their adversary defeated forever only to have a minion, perhaps even a mindless undead like a skeleton, remove the stake from their paralyzed master? A defeated vampire may even choose to go into hibernation for a time to throw off the pursuit. But it is not dead or destroyed, and will be back. Woe to those who defeated it, or maybe even woe to their children or grandchildren. Vampire personalities. One of the curses associated with vampirism is the simple, but elegant torment. Their once pure desires and pleasures are twisted by their dark fate. Love turns to hungry obsession. Friendship turns to bitter jealousy. Instead of emotion, vampires pursue people and objects that remind them of their former passions. Many vampires have been known to amass collections of statuary, books, arms and armor, and other works of art that would thrill many a historian, only to let the collection molder in some disused corner of their lair. One of the most common obsessions among vampires is collection of mortals that resemble, or are possibly related, to those persons that they knew in life. These individuals are often helped by a mysterious benefactor. Medicines and cures arriving to save them from illness. The taxes paid when the family farm would have been lost otherwise, and other such aid and assistance given to the family. Then, one day, a coach arrives inviting the family to meet the mysterious benefactor. The family becomes food, the one which the vampire was interested becomes a vampire spawn. The love bonds the vampire desired is forever lost in the creation of a new slave. Who will the vampire choose as victim? This choice will be subject to the whims of the personality of the vampire in question. Some vampires will feed from any likely victim that will not be missed, drinking deeply and killing quickly, often disguising their kill with signs of violence and struggle. Just another sailor brawl on the docks last night. Other vampires take a little from this victim, a little from that, treating the world as a smorgasbord to be sampled and savored. Not raw, vampire saliva can seal over the puncture wounds. Still, others seek a particular type of victim. Perhaps, women with auburn hair and green eyes. Once they have found such, they will visit this victim, night after night, draining her over subsequent days, while the family believes that the poor victim has some illness. There are vampires that claim that they only drink from the evildoer, watching and waiting for someone to commit an evil act, which they punish. There are some vampires that choose to feed on victims that have imbibed intoxicating substances, so that they can then experience the effects secondhand. The truth is that there is very little rhyme or reason to the tastes of an individual vampire. They match the personality, and if looked for by investigators, the pattern will be discernible, though it may take time for it to be realized. Who will the vampire choose to make vampire? Obviously, not every victim of a vampire attack will rise to become a vampire. Thus, the question of who they will choose to convert is an important one. Once again, we must turn to the personality of the vampire as our guide in answering this question. There is almost always some purpose to the conversion, or some need that the vampire is trying to fulfill by the conversion. It is also an important consideration as, at some time in the past, someone chose to make your current vampire into a vampire. Why? What made them think that they could be successful? The most common reason seems to be the creation of some connection to their former lives. Vampires have been known to seek those that resemble those that they knew in life. Lovers, or companions, with which the living being that became the vampire had a close bond. In their attempt to recreate that bond in death, the vampire will attempt to seduce, or failing that, force vampirism on its chosen victim. The choice of conversion may be as simple as "I need a thrall, you'll do." If you subscribe to the theory that the vampire creator can rest in the grave of its vampire spawn, then this reasoning becomes an almost necessary move upon entering a new area. When time permits a good choice, a vampire will choose someone that can pass among the living without inviting undue attention. They would avoid the very old or very young, or those of the non-human races, as those races do not have the nearly universal acceptance that humans have. While it is no necessity, because vampires are all too aware that human prejudice has made ugly people suspect, vampires are almost always formed from persons who have above average looks. The stunningly beautiful are avoided, as these persons can rarely blend into the crowd. Vampire life. Always remember that vampires are formerly mortal creatures that have become, effectively immortal, yet they lack the knowledge of how to live an immortal life. One of their greatest weaknesses is boredom. Most vampires exist where there is a large population of potential victims, usually cities. This may be the city of their original home, or they may have taken the time and energy to move grave dirt to this new abode and settled in. The trick, if you allow it, of resting in the grave of one of its spawn is never more than a temporary or emergency measure. They need their own place, their own coffin, their own tomb to rest comfortably and deeply. Except in areas where many deaths can go unnoticed, it will become necessary for the vampire to relocate from time to time. This time of dislocation and relocation is a period of great vulnerability. Vampires know this, and will often plan such moves years in advance. Vampires, when possible, create lairs in grand defensible locations such as castles, fortified manors, or abandoned religious institutions. Once again, personality is key. I have heard a legend of a vampire that laired in an asylum, another who had his lair adjacent to a hospital, essentially a morgue and funeral home. The key features are defensibility, avoidance of suspicion, and ease of disposal of corpses and other refuses. Vampires will often cultivate a special group of outcasts or other personal individuals as personal servitors. Examples of potential outcasts that would be useful are gypsy bands, leper colonies, the insanes, or even the poor and destitutes. A little kindness or good treatment on these ordinarily persecuted individuals and groups, and the vampire has created a loyal group of followers to do its bidding. Vampires with class abilities. If you have chosen to go to the trouble of creating and running a vampire non-player character, then you should provide them with the abilities of a character class. Not only does it provide a plausible excuse for the apparent wealth of the NPC, but it will give your players a reason for interacting with these retired adventurers. As former adventurers, they can play the role of advisors and mentors. You may also be faced with the dilemma of one of your player characters being defeated and becoming the target of a vampire, and becoming a vampire themselves. My personal rule: such a player character would be considered dead and lost to play, though they might be spotted at a future time. The only known cure for the curse of vampirism is a wish spell, and even that may not work if they have voluntarily taken a life as a vampire. Being forced to kill by the will of your master as a vampire spawn does not count. Legendary vampires. The Monster Manual page 296 lists regional effects for the area that surrounds the lair of a vampire. I would consider these regional effects appropriate for a vampire that has laired continually in an area for a minimum of a year. Further, they would be limited to vampires with an age of and death of at least 1 century. To my reasoning, it simply takes time for such massive and regional effects to come to pass. You are of course free to determine that the conditions are right and allow the regional effects immediately if you choose. I personally do not care for the regional effects, fine for Ravenloft and other such settings, but it is essentially a giveaway that spoils the masquerade. Still, if you want to start giving your players some clues or breadcrumbs about something that isn't quite right, the regional effects are a good place to start. Step 1. Let's review what we know about vampires. These creatures are exceptionally strong, dexterous, tough and charismatic. They are extremely intelligent and have a strong will. They have natural saving throw proficiencies in dexterity, charisma, and wisdom. They are proficient in perception and stealth. They are resistant to necrotic damage and non-magical weapon attacks. Vampire senses include dark vision 120 feet and passive perception of 17. Vampires speak the languages it knew in life, and they might choose to learn others if the need arises. Vampires move 30 feet per round on the ground. They fly 30 feet per round in bat form, and their mist form has a 20 feet per round flying movement that can hover or move through cracks without issue. Shape changer. If they are not in sunlight or running water, they can shift their form to that of a bat or a cloud of mist. Legendary resistance. Essentially, if they fail a save, they can choose to succeed instead, up to 3 times a day. Misty escape. When reduced to 0 hit points, they do not fall unconscious or die. They are instead forced to assume their mist form. They have 2 hours to reach their resting place or they will die. Regeneration. Vampires heal wounds at the rate of 20 hit points each round. This effect is delayed for 1 round if the damage was from either radiant damage or holy water. As expected, they cannot regenerate while in direct sunlight or running water. Spider climb. A vampire can climb difficult surfaces, including hanging upside down on ceilings without an ability check. Charm. While the monster manual lists this under the combat actions of the vampire, it is more appropriately utilized long beforehand to assist them in gaining entry, to gain the trust of a potential victim or to simply dispose of an inconvenient witness. Weaknesses. Forbiddance. A vampire cannot enter a residence without an invitation from one of the occupants. Running water. A vampire takes 20 hit points of acid damage if it ends the round in running water. Stake to the heart. If a piercing weapon made from wood is driven into the vampire's heart while it is incapacitated and in its resting place. Sunlight hypersensitivity. A vampire takes 20 hit points damage while in direct sunlight. In addition, whilst in sunlight, has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks. Step 2. Determine the probable strategy. Once again, much depends on the personality of the vampire in question. What does it want? What goal does it have? Is it in pursuit of any goal or obsession? While it will be working on accomplishing these goals, it also must accomplish the simple goals of food, shelter and protection. Food. It must have a population upon which it can feed and relative privacy to do so. The victims upon which it feeds must either be high-risk people to whom death is frequent. Unfortunately, such people are often quite superstitious, so feeding from them excessively will start up the rumor mill and place them on guard. Shelter. The vampire must prepare, by moving the coffin, or enough grave earth of at least 1, or probably 2 or more, suitable resting places. If the vampire is somehow defeated in combat, it knows that it must return to its resting place in no more than 2 hours, or face destruction. Therefore, it will ideally set up multiple resting spots no more than 4 miles distant from each other. This will place at least one of the resting spots within range of its 20 feet flying speed as mist. Protection. Without going into the possibility of human and supernatural guards, as well as a potential spawn, the coffin will be placed in the safest location. A simple heavy stone shelter with a tube leading downward to the coffin will do well. Step 3. Determine tactics. Obviously, the favored tactic of the vampire is to avoid suspicion that it is, in fact, a vampire. Indeed, they may do their best to foster the belief that the vampire is a legend, a mere scary story told about a demon or an evil god. The very idea that such a creature might exist is laughable. If their existence has been discovered, then it is time to engage in combat. Unless they absolutely must fight, their first thought is escape. Escape. Let them chase. Take the form of a bat and fly away. Take the form of mist and float away. Forced to fight, the vampire will utilize the class skills it had in life, enhanced by their now stronger ability scores, to fight only until a ripe time comes to escape. Even unarmed, the power of the physical blows dealt by the vampire is significant. On the hunt, the vampire will normally utilize a blow or 2 to overpower an opponent, then grapple them into the darkness, and utilize its bite to feed. It can take advantage of its 3 legendary actions to provide it with addition opportunities, and it can utilize its legendary resistance to simply avoid the effects of spells that it chooses. The vampire can call upon swarms of rats or bats, or if outside, a pack of wolves to aid it in combat. It may also call upon its servitor group, if any, to fight for it. When in bat or vampire form, the vampire may utilize its bite to cause necrotic damage to a victim. This is normally the method by which the vampire feeds, and will not often be used in combat. Step 4. DM Tips and Observations. I have included some of my observations already, in the not raw sections above. I believe that the vampire should be given proficiency in some additional skills. Deception, persuasion and performance would be very useful in managing the masquerade. History and religion would be easily justified by the long life of the vampire. It is my humble opinion that vampire spawn, which the monster manual defines as controlled vampire progeny, are an uninteresting and unnecessary addition to the monster manual. Any DM capable of running a vampire adventure is capable of adjusting to a servitor vampire. I would consider redefining the vampire spawn as a creature that was converted in haste, or for which the process was somehow flawed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and give Angry Golem a like. See you soon.